Cool. Nice. My laptop went screensaver. Okay, so I built a little GraphQL demo app, little mini GraphQL app. Here it is. You can do things like get repository info. Look at that. I can even go and get 2 repositories at the same time. Wow, this is a phenomenal app. Trust me. I can even go and list organizations and repositories and issues and collaborators and all that kind of stuff. Right? Okay, it's a pretty sweet app. It has, though, I would say one big glaring flaw right now. It has 0 authorization whatsoever. Right? Everybody can just go in here and see absolutely everything, no matter who they are or what they should have access to. Over here, I have another version of that same app. Right? So once again, I can go and get repository information. I can go and get 2 repositories at the same time. And those of you paying attention might have noticed something, though. This time when I went and got 2 repositories, I got back repo 1 with some fields missing. Collaborators been nulled out. Repo 2 is just missing altogether. It's completely gone. And that is because authorization actually took place here. We went and we hid the things that this user shouldn't be allowed to see. Okay, what did I have to do to make that happen? Well, let's go check out the diff. So as you can see, there's kind of just a couple of lines of mostly just boilerplate. I added some extensions, this magic authorize extension. I went and added that to some of my resolvers, and boom, authorization just all happened inside the app. All right, so that demo, that's effectively my talk. I'm going to come back around to it. I'm going to talk about like what it was I was just showing, like why, oops, that kind of works actually. Yeah, what it was I was showing and why, and how we built it. But first I want to set the scene a little bit, take a step back. So yeah, I'm Sam, I'm the co-founder and CTO at Oso. As you heard, we build authorization as a service. And at this point, I've spoken with, I don't know, hundreds, maybe thousands of engineering teams about authorization, many of whom are also using GraphQL. And it's a pretty common refrain that I hear that authorization in GraphQL is particularly hard, it's particularly challenging. And I sort of want to correct that. I think, well, 2 things. One, it's not so much that like authorization in GraphQL specifically is hard. Authorization just has a lot of challenges itself. And furthermore, I think there's actually specifics of GraphQL that make it, give us an opportunity to make it actually better, a better solved problem in GraphQL than anywhere else. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is kind of 2 things. So first of all, I'm going to talk about authorization in GraphQL and what makes it particularly challenging or interesting. And then I want to show some techniques for how I think we could make this something that's magical, right? So the things I'm going to be talking about are just techniques that we could go and take and apply in any GraphQL app for how to do authorization really well. And honestly, we're sort of here to gauge feedback and gauge the interest that people have in these kind of techniques. So if some of the stuff I talk about today like resonates with you, you think is an interesting problem, like please let me or let us know so we can talk about it more and share more. To put out a little bit of terminology, people often group authentication and authorization together under the umbrella of auth. So authentication is, it's about identity. Who are you? Login, username and password, single sign-on, things like that. Now I know who you are. This talk is mostly going to focus on authorization. Right? Now that I know who you are, like what is it that you can do? So as an example of seeing authorization in practice, in action, here is an example query that I wrote against GitHub's actual API. Right? GitHub has a GraphQL API. Here's an example query. Don't worry about reading it all right now. I'm going to walk you through it. All right, so at the top of my query, I'm going to get the current user, which is this like viewer field. For this current user, I'm going to fetch a bunch of organizations. For every organization, I'm going to get like the top 5 repositories by how many stars it has. And for each one of those repositories, I'm going to ask for the number of collaborators on it. So I mean, as a use case, imagine I'm building a front-end tool that wants to help people like analyze bus factor on their repositories. Like find my popular repositories and see how many collaborators they have, because I'm going to warn you about ones that don't have enough. The part of this that's relevant for authorization is about, well, can the user see this field? Right? Within the orgs, within the repos, we have this collaborators field, and can the user see it? And the answer is actually not always. The user can't always see this field in every repository. And the GitHub documentation explains that actually you need to have a specific repository level permission. You need to have a write privilege on the repository to be able to see collaborators. And so in particular, to answer this question, right, we may need to go through for every organization, understand, is the user a member of the org? For every repository, what level of permission do they have, right? Because you might be an org admin that makes you a writer on the repository and things like that. So that's an example of where authorization comes up in a GraphQL query and the kinds of things you have to do. But why is that so hard though? What about that makes that a hard problem to solve? Well, let's think about how we would, in a typical application, how would you have implemented that, the resolvers for that query, right? So you sort of maybe have a series of resolvers that ultimately ends up in the collaborators resolver that fetches the repository collaborators. I have some, pseudocode-y looking thing to say, I don't know, maybe there's some async resolver that goes and looks that up in some, database method or something like that, right? And so maybe ultimately there's a function called get collaborators that returns the collaborators for this repository. And importantly, so maybe that's where authorization happens, right? Inside get collaborators, we're asking this question, can the user do that or not? Very, very typical way of implementing authorization in any application. So what's problematic about this? Well, 3 things. So first of all, this is a pretty manual process, right? To go through every single point in your app where data can possibly be fetched, we need to go and check, well, can the user actually get that data or not, right? Can they view collaborators on this repository? Maybe that's a different answer than on a different one, and so on. It's pretty tedious. If you're not careful, it has performance implications, right? So to answer that question, as we said, we maybe need to look up someone's organization membership, their repository permissions. That maybe means another trip to the database, right? So maybe means N+1 query problems, or at the very least, you need to start doing some start ahead of time lookups and fetches and things like that. And finally, this is super error prone. It can be super easy to forget to add a check, or maybe check for the wrong permission. And that can range from exposing data, letting people do things they shouldn't be able to do, stuff like that. And note, none of these problems are really specific to GraphQL, right? These are all problems that we see come up in pretty much any application we work with. The thing that is maybe interesting or unique in GraphQL is how you sort of need to solve this in a very principled, generic way, right off the bat. Because in a typical REST app, right, I have a use case where I want to do some collaborator analysis. I might just throw up a new endpoint to say get repo collaborators. I can check the permissions there in an ad hoc way and call it a day. But sort of when you're working with this sort of flexible query model where adding another endpoint isn't really the solution, then maybe you need to start thinking about these things up front. You sort of maybe have less approaches to just deal with it in an ad hoc way every time it comes up. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to solve this properly from the start. So how can we do that? How can we make the situation better? So this is where I come back to my demo from the beginning. And what I see is maybe a magic wand version of everything I just spoke about. Right? So instead of manually going through and adding this line of code to every single place I need to, what if it just was all automatic? We didn't have to do anything. Instead of needing to think about performance ahead of time, what if it was just able to get the data it needed ahead of time and batch it for me? And similarly, instead of needing to remember this and make sure I did it correctly, what if I just knew it was always going to be doing authorization all the time? That's what I claim is a magic wand version of this. And that's what my demo is trying to show, how we could do this. So again, I built a sort of mini version of GitHub. It's written in Python using the Strawberry GraphQL framework, which is a blast to work with if you haven't. And the authorization side is implemented with a GraphQL middleware. So the idea is that this thing runs as a middleware to proxy requests. It also has hooks into the application. So when we need to do things at the application level, we can do that. And it's going to call out to OSO for authorization. Right, so remember I said, OSO is authorization as a service. In this demo, in this talk, the specifics of OSO isn't necessarily relevant. It's a stand-in here for, we have some API that implements authorization. That's the core part of this, right? When my app needs to answer, well, can the user do such a thing? It has an API to call out. And in this, I'm just going to be saying, it's going to query OSO, it's going to ask OSO, can the user do these things? All right, so let me show you a little bit more of the details, the step-by-step of what was going on earlier. All right, so, oops, here we go. Run this demo. Okay, so the first thing the middleware is going to do, it's going to look at my GraphQL schema, right? So remember, I just had a regular Python GraphQL app without any authorization added, and so and it's capable of spitting out my GraphQL schema, and here it is. What this middleware is going to do, it's going to look at the schema and extract out relevant pieces of authorization information. So for example, it looks through and it's like, hey, I have this type repository and that has an ID. Well, that means it's very, very likely that repository is going to be effectively a piece of data that we should protect, right? It's something that probably lives in a database. It's like identifiable by an ID. That's a good candidate as something to protect. Right, so it goes through that whole schema and looks at these and says, okay, cool. Like I found issues, organizations, repositories, and users. These are all different kinds of data that we might want to protect access to. And so like that's kind of like part one. Like, okay, looking at the schema and being like, what can I derive and infer from that schema? We can kind of go a step further and be like, well, what if we were to start looking and being and like thinking ahead of like what kind of access control we should implement, right? So we can, in particular, here's a good example. Okay, we have this repo field on a query. It takes in a repo ID and outputs a repository. Sounds pretty likely that that's a thing that it's going to look up a repository by repo ID, and so that's the thing we should authorize, right? We should check, can the user read this repository with this ID, right? That's a piece of information we can derive just from looking at the GraphQL spec and things like that. The other thing that this demo is currently doing, though, is it's going to let you annotate and add some configuration yourself. So, for example, on that collaborators field, this is where I want to get more granular. I want to kind of guide the process a little bit. The collaborators field requires you to have the view members permission on the repository. And so I annotated this authorize field directive to kind of hint towards the system. That's what it should be doing. All right, so what we're kind of doing here is looking through, the fact that we have like a well-defined schema for different queries we can make is a really great starting point to be able to answer the question of like, what authorization do we need to do in the app? Okay, well, so where this comes in handy, right? Remember, I go and make that request. I go and fetch, query for a particular repository. We can take that query. We can basically say, well, what authorization needs to happen here? We have all the information we need. So in this case, maybe accessing that repo field, we already knew that meant we should be able to read the repository. And the collaborators one, we said, well, that means we also need to be able to view members. And this is all happening like right at the beginning of the query. We can just immediately be like, I know what authorization needs to happen. And so in this case, the middleware itself, if I hop back into here, right? The middleware itself is intercepting these queries and it's saying, all right, the collaborators field, I'm logged in as Ringo down here. Ringo, you don't have access to collaborators. I'm going to null it out. Repo 2, you don't even have access to it at all. I'm going to completely hide it from you. Whereas, I don't know, if I'm logged in as like Mike or something, oh, look, Mike can still see repo 1, and now Mike can see repo 2. That's all just purely happening in that authorization middleware for GraphQL. So to kind of play back what just happened, right? We started with a plain old GraphQL app. We looked at the GraphQL schema, and we're like, okay, the query for a repo probably means reading a repository. And in line, we can now just do the authorization, right? Given that we have an API to answer that question, can Mike, John, Ringo, can they see this repository? Given that yes-no decision, we can go and immediately start implementing or enforcing our permissions in line. I wanted to call out, so pause there if you will take that in a bit. So at this point, I wanted to talk a little bit and segue a little bit into talking about some of the stuff that the folks at Apollo have been doing in this realm as well, because there's a lot of really interesting parallels happening there. So for example, they recently added a new feature in the Apollo router that allows you to similarly annotate your schema with this requires scopes directive. And again, very similar mindset here, which is, can we use the graph as a place to express things like what permissions we need to check or what scopes you need to have to be able to see a different field. And similarly, what it's able to do is at the router level when that query comes in, if you don't have the required scope, yoinks that field out of the query. Like I'm not even going to go and bother making that request or hitting that subgraph if I don't need to. So I think this kind of maybe paints the picture of like the direction the ecosystem is moving here, right? We when we start thinking about like what could we unlock if we do authorization at the graph level, you can start seeing like the schema is this place for doing configuration, a good place to sort of annotate more information, more rich information about authorization, as well as a really efficient place just to like get in there and do the authorization itself. And so kind of, I see this moving towards a world where there's maybe different layers of authorization happening, right? Right at the beginning, you have the router layer that can maybe deny access to entire subgraphs based on scopes, all the way down to, at the application level, specific pieces of data, whether or not it's accessible based on permissions, all being driven by this like one same thing, which is like you put it in a graph and you have a little bit of middleware doing the enforcement. I think it's potentially a really nice place for us to end up. Okay, so the one I just showed you is in some ways the easy case because we had a lot of information up front. Like I was asking for a specific repository and I could just say if you could read it or not. But let's look at a more complex example, right? So what if we have one of these list endpoints again, right? So going back to my query from beginning, I want to get some number of organizations, and for each of those, get some number of repositories, and for each one of those, get the collaborators. This time, when we go and look at what authorization should happen for this query, it's going to be a bit different and kind of incomplete, right? Because we don't have a concrete repository ID to index on. The best we can say is something like, to access this org's, the org's nodes path just requires us checking that you can read some number of organizations. And like similarly, I know you're going to list repositories, but I don't know which ones yet. So maybe all I know is that I should probably do some authorizing of them. And so kind of a somewhat naive implementation of like doing the authorization here is to go and prefetch as much as we possibly can. Right, so with, again, with OSO, we go and ask OSO, okay, just tell me everything. Or all the orgs, all the repos, and so on that I have access to. And so maybe as a response, we say, okay, actually, all organizations are public, so there's no filtering to do there, but you have access to, I don't know, a couple of dozen of repositories, and within that, you have access to another dozen or so where you can actually view the collaborators. Kind of a heavy-handed approach, but like, let's just get it all up front. Now, this is, the kind of the cool thing here is this is actually a pretty, somewhat naive, but in many cases actually is kind of enough to solve for authorization. Right, so going back to my little demo app, that is what's happening here. Right, so when I go and run my list org repos query, and I am logged in as John, might be hard to see exactly what's going on here, but like for the Beatles org, I get back one of the repos, but the Monsters Inc. org, all the repo nodes are being filtered out. I didn't have access to any of the repositories, right? And this is being powered by that, like, I'm going to prefetch upfront all the orgs, all the repos. I'm taking that information. The app is then going to go and like actually filter the result set at the database level based on that response. So some pretty powerful stuff we could unlock here by doing this querying upfront. And kind of where I see, but where I see this kind of going, right? If this is the starting point, what's the potential? Well, I think, I very intentionally in this demo used relay as the way that I'm handling these like, unbounded connections with, unbounded number of results. I could imagine this type of thing plugging into maybe relay plus like a data loader pattern, whereas I fetch back a page of repositories, I then go and pass those across to my middleware and say, okay, I've got 10 concrete repositories now, get all the information, all the necessary information I need on like what permissions I have. And like, I think like, you can still leverage, get a lot of benefit out of having this sort of plan upfront, like I showed up here, a plan upfront of this is the kind of authorization that we're going to have to do in this request. And as soon as you get a little piece of information, like a specific organization or repository, you can kind of fill out maybe the rest of this, like this graph of data that you need. All right, so that was the demo. So my question is, I don't know, is this better? Is this better than how we might have done it otherwise? I think so. I think so. I think we were able to achieve our Magic 1 version pretty well here, right? So it was a couple of lines of code. It was like adding an extension to make all of this stuff happen, right? We can do things like default to using GraphQL semantics to configure it, right? So if it's a query, check for read permission. If it's a mutation, like look at the name of the mutation and use that for what permission the user needs. And with that in place, you can actually do a lot of like the authorization configuration just upfront from the schema itself. Plus, having things like a custom directive, using the schema as like the layer to communicate requirements, you can use things like that little directive I had, authorize field, to go and just like add more information. Like this field requires a little bit more permissions. We can go and put that in there. I think the general approach of having like a middleware that can look at the schema, can look at the query, unlocks a lot for how much authorization you can do ahead of time, right? We're able to look down that whole query and just see everything that we needed to check. And we could do that in like one request to whatever, OSO, our authorization service, rather than making potentially hundreds of requests as we go through the graph. And then finally, I think the pattern of having a middleware, it's a thing we see a lot as kind of the dream state of authorization is you just have like one place that all authorization flows through, because at that point you can guarantee that authorization is happening where it needs to. So as I said at the beginning, kind of part of our motivation for talking about these techniques is that, one, feel free to go take these, go back to your implementations, your GraphQL apps, and implement them. I think these techniques are broadly applicable beyond just the specific middleware thing that we wrote. But more broadly, like we are interested in gathering, feedback and interest on these topics in general. Like, are these stuff that people are interested in learning more about? And if so, you can help us by giving us your feedback at this URL. So it's tinyurl.com/oso-GraphQL. There you can basically tell us, like, yeah, I think this is an important problem. Maybe we solved it already, but it took us 9 months to get there, and it would be cool if someone had solved it. Or you see this as a looming problem and you wish there was more people talking about it. That's the way that you can help us. Like, should we talk more about this? Should we share these ideas out more broadly? Should we, release the middleware stuff that we wrote? And yeah, feel free to come and find us here at the conference. So we have a booth just outside on the right. Again, we are OSO. And you can also reach out to me, through email, on Twitter. You can go to our website, osohq.com, and there's like plenty of links there to get in touch with us through various means. But yeah, I hope this was interesting. I hope you learned a lot. And again, we're keen to hear more. Thank you all.